thought my marriage was built on love, until I discovered it was nothing more than a contract. He thought I'd stay quiet. He was wrong. This is how I turned his betrayal into his downfall. When I first met Daniel Montgomery, I thought I'd stumbled into the kind of love people write novels about. He was charming, confident, and came from a family that seemed flawless. Polished smiles, wealth, and reputation that made people bow their heads when they walked into a room. To me, a small-town girl from a middle-class background, Daniel was everything I had ever dreamed of. We met at a gala hosted by his father's foundation. I was there as part of my company's sponsorship team, just doing my job, when Daniel spotted me from across the room. His smile disarmed me, and when he walked over, he spoke with the kind of ease that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. From that night on, we were inseparable. He took me on trips, introduced me to fine dining, and showered me with gestures that made me believe I was his world. For the first time in my life, I felt like a princess in a modern-day fairy tale. My friends envied me, my parents adored him, and everywhere we went, people admired us. When he proposed, on a quiet rooftop overlooking the city skyline, I said yes without hesitation. I thought I was marrying for love, but little did I know, my marriage would never be mine. It was a contract, a transaction, a deal struck long before I ever walked down that aisle in white. At the time, though, I was blinded by love and the promise of a future that felt golden. I didn't realize that Daniel's kisses came with secrets and his family's smiles hid masks, and I didn't know that one day those secrets would shatter me, but also remake me into something stronger. Because while Daniel believed I was just a pawn in his family's game, he underestimated me. He thought he held the power, but power has a funny way of shifting, especially when love turns into betrayal. The first year of our marriage was everything I imagined it would be. Lavish parties, weekend getaways, endless gifts, and Daniel always by my side. But slowly, the fairy tale glow began to dim. At first, it was small things. He started staying late at work more often, dismissing my questions with quick reassurances. He would take calls in the other room, lowering his voice until I couldn't hear a word. When I asked him about it, he would brush it off. Business matters, nothing important. But the problem was Daniel had never been this secretive before. I remember one night when we were at his family's estate for dinner. His father, Richard Montgomery, had poured himself a glass of bourbon, swirling it slowly as he spoke to Daniel. "You know the terms," he said, his tone carrying a weight that sent a chill down my spine. "Don't forget why this marriage matters." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. What did he mean by terms? And why was my marriage being spoken of like a deal? Daniel glanced at me quickly before replying in a clipped voice. "I haven't forgotten." He changed the subject after that, but I couldn't shake the unease that crawled up my chest. I wanted to believe it was nothing. I wanted to believe my husband loved me for me, but the cracks were starting to show. Another time, I walked into his study to leave him a note, only to find him hurriedly shoving a stack of papers into a drawer. He looked startled, like a child caught stealing. "Just business," he muttered again, forcing a smile. It was always just business. But I wasn't blind. There was tension whenever his family was around. His mother, Eleanor, would give me polite smiles that felt rehearsed, while his father studied me like I was a chess piece he wasn't sure how to use. And yet, whenever I asked Daniel directly, he'd kiss my forehead, hold me close, and whisper, "Don't worry about them. You're my wife." That's all that matters. I wanted so badly to believe him. But the truth was beginning to gnaw at me. My heart told me something wasn't right, even if my mind refused to accept it. It was like living in a glass castle, beautiful, dazzling, and seemingly perfect from the outside. But inside, hairline cracks were spreading across the walls, threatening to shatter everything. And deep down, I knew that sooner or later, the glass would break. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Daniel was at work, and I had stayed home nursing a headache. I wasn't planning to snoop. I had no reason to, at least not consciously, but something drew me to his study that day. The storm outside rattled the windows, and the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. I walked past his desk, past the shelves of perfectly aligned books, until my eyes fell on the drawer he always guarded so carefully, the one he never let me near. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the faint echo of Richard Montgomery's words. "Don't forget why this marriage matters." With trembling hands, I pulled the drawer open. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Contracts, balance sheets, investment portfolios. But then, tucked beneath a stack of files, I found a thin, leather-bound folder. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. Inside was a document that stopped my heart. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Marriage Agreement." My breath caught in my throat as I read line after line. It wasn't just a prenup. It was a contract. The Montgomery family had drafted it months before Daniel proposed to me. It detailed financial obligations, business mergers, and clauses that tied my marriage to their empire. There were even stipulations about heirs, when we should have children, how many, and what rights they would hold in the family's corporations. And then I saw it, Daniel's signature. Not from the night of our wedding, but dated weeks before he ever slipped that ring onto my finger. The truth hit me like a dagger. Our marriage, my marriage, wasn't born out of love. It was born out of strategy. A calculated business deal between Daniel and his family. I felt sick. The walls of the study seemed to close in on me. Every romantic moment, every kiss, every whispered, "I love you." Was it all part of this plan? I dropped the folder back into the drawer, my hands shaking so hard I could barely close it. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled out of the room. I wanted to scream, to break something, to confront him right then and there, but I didn't. I sat in silence, waiting for him to come home, pretending nothing had changed, while inside, my heart was cracking wide open. That night, when Daniel walked in and kissed me like he always did, I smiled back. But behind my smile, a storm was brewing, because now I knew. And once you know the truth, You can never go back. Once I knew the truth, everything Daniel did began to look different. His late nights at the office, his coldness after family dinners, the way his father spoke to him in riddles that suddenly didn't feel like riddles anymore. But instead of confronting him right away, I decided to watch, to observe, to see just how deep this charade really went. The next weekend, his parents invited us to a charity gala. Normally, I loved these events. The gowns, the glittering lights, the chance to play the part of Daniel's beloved wife. But that night, I felt like an actress in a play I hadn't agreed to perform in. Richard Montgomery stood tall at the center of the room, his presence commanding, his words sharp. He shook hands with politicians, smiled at investors, and whispered instructions to Daniel like a general sending a soldier into battle. At one point, I caught Richard's eyes on me, cold, assessing, not the gaze of a father-in-law, but the gaze of a man inspecting an asset. Later, as Daniel excused himself to take a call, I lingered near the edge of the ballroom, pretending to admire the paintings. That's when I overheard Eleanor Montgomery's voice. She's perfect for appearances, Eleanor said to a woman I didn't recognize. And the contract keeps everything secured. Daniel can manage her as long as she doesn't start asking questions. The blood drained from my face. Manage me, like I was a commodity. I held my glass tighter, my nails biting into my palm. When Daniel returned, his mask slipped too, a little. I asked him lightly, "What did your mother mean about me being perfect for appearances?" For a moment, I saw something in his eyes. Panic, guilt, calculation. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual charming smile. "You're imagining things," he said, kissing my hand. "You always overthink, sweetheart." But his grip on my fingers was too tight, and I realized something chilling. Daniel wasn't the man I thought I married. He wasn't just my husband. He was his father's son, a man molded by power, control, and secrets. And if his mask was starting to slip, I would be ready. Because while Daniel thought he was managing me, he had no idea that I'd already stepped out of the role he and his family had cast me in. I wasn't going to be their pawn. I was going to be the player. For weeks, I carried the truth in silence. The contract sat like a ghost in my mind, haunting every touch, every word Daniel spoke. I told myself to wait, to be smart, to gather more pieces before making my move. But patience has limits, and mine snapped one evening in the most ordinary of ways. It was a Tuesday. Daniel came home late, again. His tie was loose, his shirt collar undone, his phone buzzing endlessly with messages he refused to answer in front of me. I had cooked dinner, I had waited. And when he sat across from me at the table, scrolling through emails instead of looking at me, something inside me shattered. "Daniel," I said quietly, my voice sharper than I intended. "Do you love me?" He froze, just for a second. Then he gave me that practiced smile, the one he always used when dodging uncomfortable questions. "Of course I do. Why would you even ask that?" I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Because I found it." His smile faltered. "Found what?" "The contract." The word hung between us like a guillotine. His fork clattered against the plate. For the first time, I saw his mask fully crack. His face hardened, his eyes turned cold, and the man sitting across from me wasn't my husband anymore. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling like a man who had been caught but no longer cared. "So, you know," he said flatly. Tears burned in my eyes. "So it's true. Our marriage, it was never about love. It was about business, about power." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You don't understand. This is bigger than you, bigger than us. My family's legacy depends on this. You're part of something important." "I'm not part of anything," I spat. "You used me. You lied to me." For the first time in my life, I saw Daniel without the charm, without the polished exterior. I saw the ruthless man his father had raised, and I realized something terrifying. I had loved a mask, a carefully crafted illusion. The man behind it had never loved me at all. The breaking point had come, and now there was no turning back. Because from that night on, I wasn't just his wife. I was his enemy. After the confrontation, the house felt like a battlefield. Daniel and I still shared a roof, but nothing else. He avoided me, buried himself in work, and when we did speak, his words were clipped, rehearsed, transactional. The warmth was gone, if it had ever been real at all. But if he thought I would crumble in silence, he was wrong. I began to plan. The first ally I found was someone I hadn't expected. Clara, my closest friend since college. She had always been sharp, intuitive, the kind of woman who could smell a lie before it was spoken. When I finally confessed everything, the contract, the deception, the Montgomery's power games, her eyes widened with fury. "He thinks he can play you like a pawn?" she hissed. "No, you're smarter than him and you have me. We'll figure this out." Her loyalty gave me strength. Then there was Michael, Daniel's former business associate. I'd always noticed how he bristled in Richard Montgomery's presence, how he spoke in half sentences, as if holding back truths. So I reached out. Over coffee, I asked careful questions, probing without revealing too much. And slowly, Michael opened up. "You're not the first person Richard has manipulated," he said darkly. "Daniel, he's trapped in his father's web. But if you want to take them down, you'll need proof, solid proof, documents, transactions, deals they've hidden. Without that, they'll bury you." Proof. That word became my obsession, so I started small. Late at night, when Daniel was asleep, I slipped into his study. I scanned files, took photos, sent encrypted copies to a secret folder Clara had helped me set up. Every paper, every hidden memo, every signature that smelled of deceit, I gathered it all quietly, piece by piece. And as I worked in the shadows, something changed inside me. The heartbreak was still there, the betrayal still raw, but beneath it, a new version of myself was forming, one colder, sharper, more determined. If Daniel and his family had seen me as weak, they were about to learn how wrong they were, because whispers were turning into strategy, and strategy would soon turn into war. By the time autumn arrived, I was no longer the woman Daniel thought he married. The quiet, devoted wife had been replaced by someone calculating, someone willing to strike back, and the first move had to be bold enough to shake him. It started at a Montgomery family dinner. Those gatherings had always been intimidating, a room full of powerful men and perfectly groomed women who treated me like a decorative accessory rather than a person. Richard Montgomery sat at the head of the table, his presence as suffocating as ever, with Daniel by his side like a trained heir. But that night, I came prepared. I dressed in my sharpest black dress, my hair pinned into a sleek knot, and wore the calmest smile I could muster. Inside, my heart hammered like a drum, but no one could see it. Halfway through dinner, as Richard droned on about a new business acquisition, I set down my glass and spoke clearly. Interesting. I suppose this is tied to the funds from the Cayman accounts? The room froze. Daniel's fork clinked against his plate. Richard's eyes narrowed. What did you just say? He asked, his voice dangerously calm. I tilted my head, feigning innocence. Oh, nothing. I just happened to notice a few irregularities in the documents I've seen. Of course, I could be mistaken, but I wasn't mistaken, and they knew it. The tension at the table was electric. Daniel shot me a warning look, silently begging me to stop. But I didn't. I smiled sweetly and changed the subject as if nothing had happened. But the damage was done. For the first time, I had shown my hand. Not the whole thing, just enough to let them know I wasn't in the dark anymore. That night, when we got home, Daniel cornered me in the study. His face was pale, his eyes burning. What are you doing? He hissed. I met his gaze steadily. Leveling the playing field. For the first time, he looked at me, not as his wife, not as his pawn, but as a rival. And I knew then, I had succeeded. The game had shifted. I wasn't the one being played anymore. I was the one making moves. After that dinner, everything changed. The Montgomerys no longer saw me as an ornament. They saw me as a threat. Their polite smiles at family functions became stiff, their conversations guarded. Even Daniel, once so confident in his control, now studied me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. Claire and I worked late nights, piecing together the puzzle of their corruption. Michael fed us information quietly, slipping me leads about shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent contracts Richard had buried over the years. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous it became. I knew if they caught me digging too deep, they wouldn't hesitate to destroy me. But fear wasn't enough to stop me anymore. So I devised a trap. It started with a whisper. An anonymous tip leaked to a journalist Clara knew. Just enough to spark curiosity about the Montgomery empire, but not enough to expose everything yet. I orchestrated a charity gala, hosted in Daniel's name. Outwardly, it was meant to showcase his leadership and generosity. Inwardly, it was my stage. I had gathered enough evidence to suggest, subtly, carefully, that the Montgomery's empire was built on fraud. That night, the ballroom glittered with chandeliers and laughter. The city's elite mingled, sipping champagne, unaware that the air was laced with secrets ready to explode. As Daniel gave his speech, I slipped away, moving through the crowd with the grace of a hostess. My true purpose was in the folder I carried. Documents, emails, copies of transactions, enough to ruin them if revealed. I passed them quietly to the journalist, my voice calm but my pulse racing. Use this wisely, I whispered. When the time comes, the truth will speak louder than I ever could. The journalist's eyes widened, realizing the weight of what I'd handed over. Meanwhile, Daniel smiled from the stage, oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath him was shifting. By the end of the night, whispers had already begun to circulate. Guests murmured about inconsistencies in Daniel's speech, about strange financial rumors surfacing in the press. The Montgomery name was no longer untouchable. And the best part? They didn't even know it was me pulling the strings. Not yet. The cracks I had carved into the Montgomery empire soon widened into chasms. Within a week of the gala, the first expose hit the headlines. It wasn't the full story, just enough to make people question, to cast doubt on the perfect empire the Montgomerys had spent decades building. Offshore accounts, tax evasion, fraudulent deals whispered in every boardroom in the city. The fallout was immediate. Investors pulled back, business partners demanded answers, and regulators began sniffing around. Richard raged like a cornered lion, tearing into Daniel, into the board, into anyone he thought had failed him. But behind that rage was fear. I could see it in Daniel's eyes every time he came home late at night. The arrogance he once wore so proudly had been stripped away. He no longer looked at me with smug superiority. He looked at me with suspicion. And then, one evening, his suspicion exploded. He stormed into the study where I sat reading, slamming the door shut behind him. It's you, isn't it? His voice cracked with fury. You're the one leaking information. You're the one destroying everything. I looked up slowly, calm despite the storm in front of me. What makes you think I'd do that? Don't play games with me, he shouted, his face red. You think you're clever, but you don't know what you've gotten yourself into. You can't win against my family. I stood, closing the book in my hands. Can I? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your family is crumbling. His eyes burned, but he didn't have a comeback, because deep down, he knew I was right. The final blow came at the next board meeting. Richard had called everyone together in a desperate attempt to save face, but the journalist I'd armed with evidence wasn't finished. As Richard stood at the head of the table, barking orders, the screens behind him lit up with breaking news. Montgomery Empire under federal investigation. Emails, bank records, testimonies, everything splashed across national news in real time. The board erupted in chaos. Executives turned on Richard, demanding answers. Daniel sat frozen, pale as death. And I sat quietly at the back, watching the empire collapse in the very room where it had once been flaunted as invincible. The Montgomerys had played me like a pawn, but I had become the queen, and tonight, the king had finally fallen. The Montgomery Empire didn't just stumble, it collapsed. Investigations tore through their companies like wildfire. Investors abandoned them, government agencies froze accounts, and the once mighty family name became synonymous with fraud and betrayal. Richard Montgomery, the man who thought he could control everyone with money and influence, was dragged into courtrooms under flashing cameras. Daniel wasn't spared either. His promotion vanished, his reputation shattered, The man who once sneered at me, certain I was nothing without him, now stood in the ruins of the dynasty he'd chosen over me. And the most satisfying part? They never saw the knife until it was already buried deep. But for me, this wasn't just revenge. It was rebirth. When the dust settled, I wasn't just the wife who had been betrayed. I was the woman who had outsmarted one of the most powerful families in the city. Journalists wrote about my strength, not my victimhood. Claire and I launched a new company together, built on transparency and fairness. Everything the Montgomery Empire had never been. For the first time in years, I felt free. Daniel tried once to come back. He showed up at my door, desperate, disheveled, his voice trembling. "We can fix this," he pleaded. "We can rebuild. Just don't leave me like this." I looked him in the eye, the man I had once loved, the man who had seen me as nothing but a business arrangement, and I said the words he feared most. "You were never my future, Daniel. You were just my lesson." I closed the door, leaving him in the shadows where he belonged. And as I stood there in the quiet of my new beginning, I realized something powerful. No contract, no betrayal, no manipulation could ever define me. I wasn't the woman they tried to break. I was the woman who rose from their ashes and built an empire of my own. My empire, my rules, my life. If you discovered your entire marriage was based on a lie, would you walk away quietly or fight back like I did? Tell me in the comments.